Once again, Lord, I ask that the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts are pleasing in your sight. We often talk about the need to take time for others and being available when others are in need. But we're in a society that passes by and we don't even want to know the real answer to the question that we ask often, how are you? Jesus is a great example of how we should interact with people when we see them in public. We see others coming in or going out of a store, maybe we say hi, we smile at each other, and they might say, well, how are you doing? And now we all know the politically correct answer, right? To that question like this is fine or great, or, oh, it's been a rough week, but things are getting better. But sometimes you get that one person who acts like that you really meant what you asked them when you said, how are you doing? And this tends to happen when that other person has had a really tough week, they're not doing well, and you end up spending a lot of time listening to them tell you about everything that's going on in their life, and all you wanted was to pick up a gallon of milk and a loaf of bread on your way home, right? And here we are with the disciples, and they're making some innocent observations. Wow, look at the great temple and how it looks. It's beautiful. Look at the gold and look at the decorations. Isn't it great? And I love the line in this translation where Jesus says, or where it says, but Jesus said, it kind of changes the tone of the whole conversation. The disciples were expecting something straightforward and simple, and they expected Jesus to share their appreciation for the beauty that was around them. But that's not what they got, is it? You think this temple's a big deal? There's going to be a time, and it's going to be soon, that it's going to be nothing but a pile of rocks here. Not even a big pile. It's going to be rocks strewn all over the ground. Not a single stone will be piled one on top of another. And now to an ancient Jew, suggesting that the temple would be destroyed is kind of like showing up at Thanksgiving, grabbing the turkey and stuffing off the table and throwing it out in the yard because you brought some pizzas. Right? We just wouldn't do something like that. We wouldn't even talk about something like that. Still today, in Israel, in Jerusalem, there's a section of that old temple. It's about 190 feet long. The stone in the wall are the stones that were the very stones of the temple that Jesus looked at, that Jesus was talking about to his disciples. They were put there by King Herod. To this day, Jews gather to pray before this wall. They call it the Wailing Wall. And it's all that's left from the original temple, from the second temple. Romans and Christians and Muslims all have overrun the temple since the day of Jesus. On the mount where the temple once stood sits one of the most holy sites in Islam. Where the temple stood now, the Muslim mosque, when they say they're on their trek to Mecca. Mecca is built on the holy ground that God dwelled in the temple. So this 187-foot section, there's something that's just blocked off, is part of the wall of the old temple. It's all that the Jews have left. And it's the most sacred spot in all of Judaism. 2,000 years later, men still shed blood to protect those stones. The Muslims recognized it was a place where God dwelled. The Jewish people believe that when the Messiah comes, that he's going to rebuild the temple. And the Christians understand that Jesus was the Messiah. And all of us hold this place as holy because God dwelled there. And I tell you all this just to give you a sense of what kind of impact Jesus must have had when he made that comment to his disciples. And I can imagine the disciples, they looked around in shock to see if any other Jews in the temple might have heard what Jesus said. And they gathered around him and questioned, well, when is this going to happen? And does Jesus answer them? Does Jesus ever give a straightforward answer? Not often. He gives them this cryptic warning. Watch out. People are going to show up claiming to be me. asking you to follow them. There will be wars and revolutions. There will be earthquakes and famines and terrible signs in the heavens. And you, my followers, people are going to grab you and throw you in jail and haul you to courts. Your own family is going to turn on you. Some of you will even be killed because you follow them. You're going to be hated because of me. But don't worry, stand firm. By doing that, you'll gain eternal life. And when I read a passage like this, I always wonder if the disciples might have said, you know what, Jesus? We were just trying to point out the beauty of the rocks and how beautiful day it is here today at the temple. These disciples were there trying to have a pleasant day at the temple, and they probably just finished praying, and they were strolling together in the crowd of people that were gathered in Jerusalem. And Jesus takes one little innocent comment, and suddenly we're living through war and bloodshed and persecution and torture and murder. I mean, come on now. How about just a nice walk? Is that too much to ask for? Has Jesus ever made you feel like that? Do you ever get that moment where you just want to say, God, look, just lighten up a little bit. I know there's children starving in Haiti. I know that I shouldn't have looked at that woman in the store like I did. I know I shouldn't have lied to that guy, but come on. I'm just trying to have a nice day here. We have a board game. It's called Dr. Eureka. There's a slide there, the next slide I put in it just to kind of give you an idea. So you flip this card over at the bottom, and you have to make your test tubes match by dumping the marbles without touching them with your hands. And if the marble touches the table, you're out for the round. But it's a very fast-paced and challenging. You start the round by flipping over the card, and whatever your order marbles in the test tube is when you begin, you got to get them to show to be like what's in the card. But anyway, you have to stay focused, and you can't dilly-dally, because if you wait too long, someone says Eureka, and then you're on to the next card. You know, and you have to keep your eyes focused on that card. So a lot of times someone might yell Eureka. You're like, oh, your marbles don't match. You're purple on the bottom instead of your red. And sometimes, just a good example, we were playing this last night. I thought it was a good example. I think part of what Jesus was doing that day in Jerusalem was trying to keep the eyes of the disciples focused on the big picture. The big picture is trying to get those test tubes to look like the ones in the picture. So he heard in their comments about the pretty stones, something that he thought needed to be corrected. Maybe it was the admiration for the wealth and riches of the world. Maybe in their voices he heard the sounds that we sometimes might make when we're talking about a new toy or gadget or a new car or dress that we really want. You know that sound, right? There's some excitement in our voices. You don't even need to hear a whole sentence to recognize it. Our family might be out in the store, and the kids would come up and, Daddy, you know, and you already know they have something in their hand, you know, they want you to buy. We know the sound. But maybe Jesus heard something like that in their tone of voice as they were talking about the temple. Or maybe it was their reverence for the temple itself. And it's not news to you that we humans sometimes get attached to parts of religion that we create, and we sometimes lose the sight of God, but not always intentionally. We come to worship a building, or we come to worship things. You know, these things only are there as tools to help us point to God. We get so tied up in a building or certain theology or a way of doing things that we begin to equate those things with God. And before I was younger, when I was young, I got to travel with Shane, the pastor. In his youth group, we gathered as youth and traveled to youth ministry throughout the conference. His message was often funny, but always managed to hit you in the heart. And here's a sign of how good he was. I still remember some of those things that he said in those messages. when he left that church to begin full-time ministry and youth ministry instead of pastoral ministry, he left the church, and the church that he was serving, it kind of fell apart. It was like it wasn't even a church, at least for a while. People had grown so used to him as the voice that talked to them about God that they struggled for many years. And yes, as pastors, we are to shepherd God's people. But we also need to realize, too, that it's not about me. It's about us coming together as the church. So we need to remember that no matter who's serving here. And here, this church here has had many pastors in the past 10 years. We have to be able to come together as a church and say, it doesn't matter who our pastor is, this is our mission that God has called us to, and this is what we're going to do. No matter who's standing here. And hopefully the person standing here, myself right now, can help guide and lead them. Equip us, equip you to do the mission that God has called you to do. When Solomon first built that temple, that first temple, the Bible records a prayer that he prayed at the temple when it was dedicated. In the prayer, Solomon asked God that God may always dwell in the temple, and that any prayer prayed to the temple would always be heard by God. And you can see Jews might begin to confuse the temple, something made by human hands, with God, even though God dwelled in the temple at one point. And I think Jesus wanted just to shake the disciples out of that. That's why he wants us to do that as well. Yes, we come together. This is our sanctuary. This is a place where we gather to encounter God together. Yes, this is holy ground as we gather here to worship. But it's not about worshiping this space or this building. This is another tool that God has given us to point to Him. We get too impressed or too caught up in things that sparkle before our eyes sometimes when we allow that to take the place of God sometimes. We let the things of the world that will pass away distract us from God. We let the outer trappings of religion, a building or a certain way of worshiping or a certain set of doctrines or beliefs to get in the way of the true object of our faith, Jesus, who broke down and gave his life for us, who destroyed the bondage to sin. We might just innocently lose sight of what the end results are supposed to be because we're too busy putting down one piece after another, just like in that game. We're worried about this marble, and we're not focused on the big picture. But Jesus wants to remind us of what's important. Yes, gathering together in this place to worship God, that's important. But it's also important for us to have that relationship each day. It's important for us to remember what Jesus teaches us, to go out and to be his hands and feet. And we say that phrase often, let us be the hands and feet of Jesus, but I want you to think about how are you specifically doing that? What are you doing? What have you done in the past month to be the hands and feet of Jesus? What is it that God might be asking of you? And then we look at corporately, what is God asking of us as the State Line United Methodist Church to do? And we're trying to live into those things. Our box of socks is almost full. People are going to have socks to keep their feet warm. Those are the types of things. We are able to feed folks, State Line Inn. We got a phone call this week. You have some groceries? Yeah, come by. So someone was able to come up, walk up from the motel. I was able to give them groceries because we have people bringing those things in, so we have it in our time of need. Jesus wants to remind us of what's important. And it's not just because of the love of wealth or the turning the church into idol. Those things are bad in themselves. But he's reminding us because he knows the things that will not hold up. They'll not hold us up. when the days really get hard. If you come to this building and no one else is here, you can encounter Christ. You can encounter God in this front seat of your car. You can encounter God as you're walking through the woods. This is just a shell of a place. What's important is our relationship with God through Jesus. We may not be tortured or murdered for our faith like some of our brothers and sisters still around the world, or like we read about in the scriptures. But we will all come to days in our lives where our world seems to be falling apart. We all know pain and suffering. We fall in the darkness. We find ourselves surrounded by enemies. We get betrayed by life or by friends and even by family. In those days of torment, all the things that distract us on the bright morning walks through Jerusalem, all those things, they disappear. They can't save us. They can't comfort us. Only God can comfort us. Only faith can give us the strength to stand up in the face of the worst days of our lives. Jesus didn't want his disciples to forget that truth. He doesn't want us to forget it. He was willing on that day in Jerusalem to be a little harsh to get his point across. So I want you to think, what type of things do you hold in high esteem that might be distracting you from God? Are you willing to take a closer look to make sure that your main focus is God and not on the things around us that are meant to help point us to God? Or the things of the world that distract us from God? And that's just something that's individualized for each of us. Can we make God, can we continue to allow God to be the main focus of our lives, of the life of this church? And be reminded that of what Jesus says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your soul. Love your neighbor as yourself. That's the commandments wrapped up in a simple phrase. If we're following those two, then we're not going to be breaking the 10 Commandments. We're not going to be going against the Scriptures. And then we seek God first and foremost. Let's pray. Father God, we thank you so much for your love and forgiveness. Lord, sometimes we have difficulty forgiving ourselves when we mess up. But Lord, remind us that you are always there waiting for us to return to you. Lord, we thank you for that unconditional love. And Lord, we ask that you strengthen us so that we can continue to share that unconditional love with others, with each other. So when somebody does mess up, that your grace may be shown through us. So that when we mess up, we know that we can come and receive that same grace. Not that it gives us excuses to mess up and to do things wrong, but when those things happen in our lives, may we know that your love is unconditional. Thank you, Lord. I pray this all in Jesus' name. Amen.